Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's program. My name is Gordon Kendall, and I'd like to begin with just a brief introduction. The National Arts Club is a 501c3 not-for-profit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, readings, and sessions like this. Welcome again. For more information about us, the National Arts Club, you can visit us at our new site, nacnyc.org, or find us on the socials, Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube. Today's program is one I'm very excited about, something that I think many longtime New Yorkers and many longtime fashion followers will definitely find interesting. And it is In American Fashion, Ruth Finley's Fashion Calendar by Natalie Nudell. And Natalie is the director and principal investigator of the Fashion Calendar Research Database and adjunct assistant professor, History of Art Department at FIT SUNY, Fashion Institute of Technology. She's also a textile researcher and fashion history lecturer and writer. And with that, please join me in welcoming Natalie and her presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And first, I'd like to thank Gordon Kendall and the National Arts Club's Fashion Committee. I'm honored to open this first virtual Fashion Week of 2025. Thank you to Nadine and the National Arts Club for supporting my research and scholarship, and for this program dedicated to Ruth Finley and the Fashion Calendar, and my recent publication, In American Fashion, Ruth Finley's Fashion Calendar, published by Bloomsbury Press. So, fashion as both design object, an actual garment, and image, either a painting, a photograph, something online, are understood to reflect time, culture, economic history, ideas about gender, and broader representations of identity, and have been used by scholars to delineate trajectories of fashion, design, and craft, but also techniques of the body. In this book, I approached fashion as both a changing aesthetic ideal and, in the context of the United States in the 20th century, a very real industrial sector with a myriad of commercial impulses and economic pursuits that operate within a capitalist market society. The fashion industry, although culturally marketed as glamorous, is historically known for its exploitative labor practices and its substantial negative environmental impact. Although the field of fashion studies has expanded significantly during the past 3 decades, American fashion history remains underinvestigated. The stories and histories revealed in this book expose a key force in the development of the organized American fashion system, its calendar and time system. Founded by Ruth Finley and sisters Frances and Alice Hughes in 1941, Fashion Calendar is a fascinating and poignant example of a simple, solution-oriented idea that contributed significantly to the development and culture of a national industry. My work regarding Fashion Calendar covers numerous fields and medias. I wrote and produced a fashion documentary called Calendar Girl that came out in 2022, directed by Christian D. Brun, and the film really tracks Ruth's personal experience as the doyen of the New York Fashion Calendar, and we had a chance to follow her around Fashion Week. And so if anyone is interested in watching a really fun documentary about Ruth, you should definitely check that out. In this context, for this book, I centered the fashion calendar and its publisher within a theoretical and historical framework that exposes both the publication and the publisher's role and impact during the years fashion calendar was active and during its second act as a historical archive and digital humanities project, the Fashion Calendar Research Database, which I'll elaborate on when I discuss the fifth chapter of this book. This analysis integrates historical, sociological, and anthropological analyses of calendars and their role in creating and sustaining time systems. With my reading of the archive, I argue for the structural impact of the fashion calendar over the American fashion and creative industries in the United States, and I demonstrate how the publication and its publisher helped establish and adapt a temporal architecture for a major national industry. Finley's Fashion Calendar was a serialized weekly publication until 1983, and thereafter was published twice monthly until 2014. The Ruth Finley collection, which is now held at Special Collections and College Archives at FIT, and essentially the unique fashion calendar archive, comprises almost 3,000 issues and amounts to upwards of 39,000 pages of material in a consistent text-based format. Listings in the calendars were submitted by subscribers or non-subscribers and were aimed at the press and internal industry and reflected the many adjacent American creative and manufacturing industries such as retailing, footwear, cosmetics, millinery, menswear, textiles, and more. Further, the fashion calendar also included the International Fashion Week calendars and trade events taking place around the world as the fashion industry became increasingly globalized in the late 20th century. Importantly, it included the social calendar and reflected the culture of the fashion and creative communities in the United States and abroad. Finley's calendar took a democratic approach and did not operate as a gatekeeper to participation, but sought to accurately reflect the fashion schedule and significantly worked as a service to help subscribers clear dates and avoid conflicting events during key market and presentation weeks. This book, In American Fashion, argues that fashion calendar itself became a visual representation of a centralized American fashion industry and took on the role as a symbol for time and participation within the field of fashion in New York and in the American fashion market. What many know as the Pink Bible and its longtime editor, Finley herself, embodied New York's accessible fashion market and its schedule, which led to the institutionalization of the publication in the late 20th century as the official calendar of New York Fashion Week. Importantly, this work considers how the fashion calendar was used as an essential tool to navigate the fashion and creative communities in New York and beyond. The publication was a means of communication and an entry point for participation in the American fashion market, especially before the Council of Fashion Designers of America established itself as the premier governing body of the American fashion industry. There were few institutions that unified the disparate groups that made up the creative and industrial arms of the industry. My analysis includes the content within the pages of the calendar itself to elucidate how the publication reflected broader interconnections within the constellation of commercial spheres of public relations, fashion, politics, industry, and popular culture in the United States. The fashion calendar in Finley, therefore, played a key role in the professionalization of the industry and the articulation of its community as both a mediator and cultural intermediary within what scholar Joanne Entwistle describes as an aesthetic economy of fashion. The fashion calendar helps expand our understanding of calendars and their role in setting temporal rhythms and cycles. The publication itself contributed significantly to the structuring of the American industry, but its flexibility in reflecting the dynamism of the growing industry and its unique legacy of independence from any one group made it more than a calendar or trade publication. It was integral to the open and flexibility it was integral to the open and democratic nature of the American fashion market between 1941 and 2014. Its longevity and flexibility throughout most of the 20th and early 21st centuries led the trade publication to become a key entry point for participation in the American fashion industry, leading it to become the official calendar of New York Fashion Week. This monogram is the first comprehensive study of the fashion calendar, specifically and more broadly on calendars related to staging fashion weeks and events year-round. In American Fashion presents the history of the publication and its connections to the fashion press and a broader network of professional women as central to its success. The richness of the archive helps us recognize the true diversity and complexity of the fashion community in the United States and adds poignancy to the legacy left by the publication's most visible and widely known publisher, Ruth Finley. On this slide, we see here on the left, Ruth Finley, photographed in her office in 1945. In the center, we see Ruth Finley accepting her CFDA Board of Directors Tribute Award from then President of the CFDA, or excuse me, Chairwoman of the CFDA, Dion von Furstenberg. And on the far right, there is the poster for the Calendar Girl documentary in which Ruth is the star. Chapter 1, Starting Up a Fashion Calendar, explores the gaps between the existing oral narrative and the historical record about the publication's origins and development. Through archival research, Finley's personal collection, and public records such as census data and immigration records, I reconstructed a detailed record of the history of the publication. The first chapter lays out how the creation and existence of Fashion Calendar helps illuminate issues including labor, identity, gender, religion, capitalism, and American society during the 1930s through the 1950s. Ruth Finley was born Ruth Faith Finberg on January 14th, 1920, in Haverhill, Massachusetts. She was the third of 4 children born to Anna Finberg and Joseph B. Finberg. Finley's father, Joseph, arrived in the United States in 1903, alone and as a young teenager, from Vilno, now in Vilnius, Lithuania, then part of the Russian Empire. Likely due to increased anti-Jewish sentiment in the region and restrictions Jewish people faced living in the Pale of Settlement. He also followed many waves of immigrants at the turn of the 20th century. He worked as a jeweler and then studied dentistry in Boston and later settled down and opened his dental practice in the town of Haverhill, Massachusetts. I was lucky enough to find this photograph of Dr. Joseph Finberg's dentistry office from the Haverhill Public Library. A photographer was commissioned to do a survey of all of the streets in Haverhill in 1920, and Dr. Joseph Finberg's name and advertisement is on the second floor of the W.F. Thayer shop. I love this photo because of all of the Model T cars. Finley claimed that it was during her college summers in New York that she met Alice and Frances Hughes, the 2 career women she often brought up when asked about the calendar, starting the fashion calendar. Although their casual meeting and conversation was said to have led to the conception of fashion calendar, the connections between the Hughes sisters and Finley went back further than that meeting, to the small Jewish immigrant communities of the industrial towns of the Northeast where Finley and the Hughes sisters were from and which connected them and their families. The Hughes sisters, Alice, born in 1899, and Frances, born in 1906, were actually born Alice and Fanny Felsher. They hailed from Manchester, New Hampshire, where their father settled with his wife Esther Felsher and their children after also immigrating from Vilno between 1900 and 1902. Louis Felsher owned a clothing store in Manchester where some of his older children worked. As described by scholar of American Jewish history Haja Diner, Louis Felsher followed a common trajectory of new Eastern European Jewish immigrants to the United States, who at the turn of the century predominantly entered the garment business as tailors, peddlers, or in the case of Felsher, a shop owner or merchant. The industrial towns of the Northeast saw a rise in the establishment of Jewish communities at the turn of the 20th century, as increased numbers of Jewish people fled anti-Semitism, pogroms, and economic disadvantages, and immigrated to the United States in search of economic opportunities. Manchester, New Hampshire, and Haverhill, Massachusetts are less than 40 miles apart, within an hour's drive of each other, and the small Jewish communities and congregations in the two towns have historically overlapped. Manchester was known for having a predominantly Litvak Jewish community, Jewish people from what is now Lithuania, the region where Finley's father immigrated from. It's impossible to know if Finley's father and the Felshers knew each other in Vilno, but networks of the shtetl communities they left behind were often recreated in the new country. When I asked Finley how she met the Felshers, she said it was through her father, that he was their dentist. This was confirmed when I learned about the Jewish communities in the region and the Litvak connection between the Felshers and Joseph Finberg. Finley's father immigrated in July 1903, less than a year after Esther Felsher and her children. They were all Russian and Yiddish-speaking Jews who settled in small towns adjacent to each other and likely traded goods and services. The revelation of the deeper community-based connections between Finley and the Hughes made sense, since many connections in the garment industry in New York were formed through family or communitarian bonds, both in Europe and in the immigrant communities of the United States. Here we have a photograph of Alice Hughes at a fashion show broadcast, a photograph taken and then published in the Dayton Daily News in September 1937. And on the right, Frances Hughes, listed as Francie Seidler in the Bridgeport Post from 1958. The Hughes trajectory from the industrial towns of New Hampshire to becoming noted women's pages and fashion editors in New York was similar to that of other children of immigrants during this period. Many were able to take on advanced educations and professional careers because their parents worked as merchants or in other more traditionally immigrant-dominated professions. To raise additional funds, the Felsher family hosted boarders at their home on Merrimack Street in Manchester, and later 2 Hebrew teachers who taught at the local Jewish school. As a sign of the family's growing prosperity, both Alice and Frances Hughes attended Columbia University in New York City, and Alice graduated from the Pulitzer School of Journalism in 1921, and Frances earned a degree in English literature from Barnard in 1924. Alice Hughes recounted in a 1949 article for her syndicated column, A Woman's New York, that the sisters' foray in higher education was almost cut short when their family's small savings was, quote, fleeced by Charles Ponzi, whom their parents, like many other New Englanders, invested in his get-rich-quick scheme. According to Alice, the sisters sang their way through college by singing in multiple church choirs. Importantly and critically to the entirety of this research and tracing both of their history were the Columbia University alumni registers, which I think is a critical tool in being able to trace the maiden names of these women. Because not only did they change their names to use professional names, Hughes is their last name, but then they also individually were married and then also used their married names in different contexts. And so the Columbia University Journalism School's alumni registers were really critical because they listed the professional names along with the maiden names that the students would have been known by while they were attending. After journalism school, Alice Hughes went into one of the only journalistic avenues open to women, fashion, and first worked as a copywriter for Macy's and then Arnold Constable and Company department stores. She then wrote for the publisher Hearst and for publications including the New York Post and the New York Telegram, where she had a column called Today's Woman. In 1928, Alice Hughes and then First Lady of New York State, Eleanor Roosevelt, were part of the charter group of 17 noted women working in the fashion business and press who established Fashion Group. The professional association provided community and training opportunities for women entering the fashion industry. The organization helped develop a network of women who worked within the many sectors that made up the industry and led to increased unity and information sharing. Alice also served as an officer of the organization and one of its vice presidents. By the early 1930s, Alice had traveled extensively, and while on assignment for the New York Telegram in 1933 to report on the lives of women in China, Turkey, and the USSR, she managed to get an exclusive interview with exiled Russian revolutionary leader Leon Trotsky at his hideaway on the island in the Sea of Marmara in Turkey. Alice in Russia Land was printed in newspapers around the country and lent to her status within the journalism community. Her column later became a syndicated weekly titled A Woman's New York with King's Features Syndicate, and it was published in over 30 newspapers around the world. She was renowned in her day as an expert on fashion, women, and retail, and she reported on retail conditions around the world for the industry as well. The younger Hugh's sister, Frances, also known as Francie, upon graduation from Barnard, interned at Macy's and then worked for the renowned fashion forecaster Tobey Collar Davis. In 1939, Frances Hughes became the New York fashion editor at Photoplay magazine. She married Albert Seidler, a writer and news supply salesman, and also worked as an advertising manager for the fashion publicity director for A.S. Beck Shoes. Like her sister, she became an active member of Fashion Group and in the fashion community in New York City. In the late 1940s, she became an editorial assistant to her sister's former Haverhill friend, Fleur Gardner Cowles of Look magazine. Haverhill, interestingly, was this nexus point for Fleur Gardner Cowles, Frances Hughes, Alice Hughes, Ruth, and more. With the increased growth of the industry in the late 1930s and early 1940s, there were concerted attempts at setting a structure and creating a system for the American industry, which later in the previous century transitioned from hand to machine-made cottage industry to national industry and was amplified by the ever-potent and circulated daily, weekly, and monthly local and national press. Until this point, the French haute couture houses were the global leaders in driving fashion design change, tastes, fabrics, silhouettes, and essentially delineated the fashion of the season. American manufacturers and press reproduced designs coming off the couture runways for the American market or licensed models directly from French companies. The fashion press positioned Paris as the world leader whose styles would be distilled for the ready-made clothing and home sewer markets. In 1937, several committees of Fashion Group organized the first Fashion Futures American edition, which was a style promenade that took place at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and was devoted to an extensive showing of American fashion. Alice Hughes, with her many connections in the retail market and notoriety in the fashion press, served on both the planning and production committees with Eleanor Lambert, who is the most widely known for starting Press Week and being an extremely important leader in PR throughout the rest of the century. When Great Britain and France entered the Second World War in September 1939, fashion information dispatched from Europe virtually came to a halt. In a September 9th, 1939 article in Women's Wear Daily, Paul Bergman, Central European staff correspondent for Fairchild Publications, who had just returned stateside after fleeing the Anschluss in Vienna, predicted that if the war continued, the U.S. fashion industries would overtake their European counterparts. For multiple reasons, including improvements in American garment retail distribution, as well as manufacturing. With the occupation of Paris in early summer 1940, most of the haute couture houses were temporarily shut down. American manufacturers were presented with the need to design their own collections. An article published by the editors of Women's Wear Daily on June 24th, 1940, titled Trade Watches Fate of France with Anxiety, Manufacturers, Retailers Would Aid Reconstruction of Couture, Burden Now on American Creators, asserted that the current military and political situation in Europe was too confused to make any assertions about the future. So as a result, the American firms were really forced to have their own designers design collections aimed at an American audience, designed by American designers who previously were really just focusing on copying copying French haute couture samples. The September-October 1940 fashion shows in New York marked a transition when most retailers and manufacturers presented fashions designed in the US and highlighted the American design vernacular. As with any major global event happening in real time, people were adjusting. And interestingly, after the shows took place on October 17th, 1940 in Women's Wear Daily, this this list of recommendations was published as an open letter by 10 fashion journalists aimed at uh, helping structure the American fashion industry. Now that we're doing this and that we are actually designing our collections and hosting Fashion Week, how are we going to organize it? And so this open letter really lists demands like timing fashion shows within the working day, sending announcements of shows a week in advance, starting shows on time, things that, funnily enough, sometimes people complain about today. But interestingly, um, one of the signatories of the letter was Alice Hughes, who at the time was at the New York Post. As I untangled the many narratives behind the publication, it became clearer that the stories told and untold were emblematic of the broader histories of the United States during the first half of the 20th century. The political atmosphere of the Second World War era, which was heavily nationalistic, anti-Semitic, and patriarchal, was certainly a challenging environment for female business owners as they navigated the nascent fashion industry in New York. Finley graduated from Simmons College in 1941, and soon thereafter she walked into the Essex County Court in Salem, Massachusetts, and filed a name change request, changing her family name from Finberg to Finbury. With the war in Europe in full swing and the fashion calendar in its infancy, the publication appeared to be a passion project for the Hughes sisters, who launched the calendar within 6 months of this Women's Wear Daily open letter. Like so many other young Americans, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941 by Japanese forces and the entry of the U.S. into the war, Finley joined the war effort, and Ruth Finberg worked as a representative for the National Jewish Welfare Board with the USO and was stationed in North Carolina, where there were a concentration of military sites. Meeting minutes from the JWB's war correspondence showed Finley reverted to using her Jewish-sounding last name while at the JWB. Evidently, the Hughes sisters and Finley distanced themselves from their Jewish and Russian Litvak immigrant identities by using professional names and with little trace of their true origins. After all, Alice Hughes was actually born in Vilno and immigrated to the United States as a child. Other than census data from her childhood, likely submitted by her parents, Alice claimed that she was born in Manchester, New Hampshire, and kept the details of her birthplace and her family's immigration completely private. Only the 1910 census lists Alice as being born in the Russian Empire. The 1930 census lists her as a reporter for the home pages, with both her parents' birthplaces listed as New Hampshire. By 1933, Alice Hughes had also traveled to the USSR multiple times and likely even spoke Russian. But again, all of these tactics were really adopted in order to create a distance from her heritage. The Finberg family similarly faced similar circumstances, which were retold by Finley when asked about her name. Finley's older brother was the first to change his family name, and he chose Finbury with the idea that it would help him overcome the anti-Jewish sentiment in the military and that he could be admitted to the U.S. Navy. Finley adopted Finbury as her last name, but as soon as she started working on the phone, it was suggested to her that Finbury was too long and too cumbersome of a last name with 3 syllables, and that it should be a quick 2-syllable short name, and therefore Ruth adopting Finley she's really the only one in her family to have that name. Whether for personal security or driven by generational trauma, the 3 women changed their names and identities to assimilate into broader American society. As discussed by Kirsten Firmaglick in her fascinating study on the history of Jewish name changing in the United States, most people listed on their applications the inability to gain employment or hindrance within the workforce as the primary reason for changing their name. Firmaglick used New York City court records in her study and found that an 800% increase in requests for name changes in 1942, and 66% of those were to change from a Jewish sounding last name. Ironically, the fashion and garment business in New York was overwhelmingly dominated by Jewish people and Jewish immigrants, from the manufacturers to the labor force, which is made up of immigrants from all over the Jewish diaspora. So much so in 1937, the entire industry, save for large retailers, shut down for the Jewish Day of Atonement, the holiday Yom Kippur, and the Hughes sisters and Finley, although were journalists and public facing, their work went beyond 7th Avenue and its Jewish community. Here we have a really great array of fashion calendar covers, and as we'll see, we'll be looking at more issues and pages from within the calendar. The one thing that really stayed the same throughout its 70 years in print were the listings. The one thing that changed were the covers, and they really fascinatingly also sort of reflect shifts and changes in graphic design throughout the century. Chapter 2 focuses on networks of power, Press Week to New York Fashion Week. And it traces the history of the seasonal fashion presentations in New York, from retail and department stores to Eleanor Lambert's Press Week, and the model it created for a centralized fashion market weeks to come. Through the reading of listings and fashion calendar, the trade discourse surrounding the schedule and market weeks, the characteristic tensions behind the industrial and creative sides of the industry are revealed. The calendar's accessibility made it an important part of a tool for participation. And we could see here in this this page from July 19th, 1943, the first listing for the New York Dress Institute's Press Week, which was the first iteration of a centralized fashion week that was held starting in 1943 as a way to promote American manufacturers and designers and brands during the war, because there was a fear that during the war, people would stop buying clothes essentially. And what happens is so the New York Dress Institute hired Eleanor Lambert to figure out ways to continue selling clothes, and the creation of Press Week, in order to really publicize widely American design, was used to fill that gap. The chapter 2 really traces New York Fashion Week all the way from Press Week to the centralization of New York Fashion Week by the Council of Fashion Designers of America, another organization started by Eleanor Lambert, with 7th on 6th, which was the first iteration of New York Fashion Week at Bryant Park. Here we have the first grid calendar that was published and circulated for the first Fashion Week, which was spring 1994, held in the fall of 1993. And on the right, we have a photograph of the first tents being set up in Bryant Park in 1993, which I think really gives a great perspective on how much smaller scale the event was in the 1990s. Chapter 3 really focuses on how the fashion calendar also operated as the social calendar, and is an incredible resource for understanding the myriad of communities and people who have participated over time, as well as all of the different communitarian pursuits that the fashion community rallied around over time. Through readings of the types of causes and events that appeared in Fashion Calendar, the imagined community that it helped articulated united over more than just a common drive for profitability and commercial success. The fashion community came together to support shared social, nationalistic, and patriotic causes, particularly during wartime. The social causes supported by the fashion community reflected the demographics of its labor force, the March of Dimes, which was for polio, and the National Jewish Hospital in Denver, Colorado, were prominent causes supported by key players and organizations. During the 1980s and 1990s, the fashion and creative communities were crushed by the AIDS and HIV/AIDS epidemic, and it became a unifying force and primary cause for benefits and fundraisers. By using philanthropy as a starting point, Chapter 3 focuses on listings about events that used fashion show format and fashion culture for political and/or philanthropic ends. A quantitative analysis of the political and philanthropic uses of fashion shows, presentations, auctions, and so on for non-commercial means is covered, and how they're linked to the deployment of public relations techniques and soft power, as well as nation branding in the post-war period. In 2014, Ruth Finley retired and sold the fashion calendar and the rights to schedule New York Fashion Week to the Council of Fashion Designers of America, who continues to run the CFDA fashion calendar today. It is today exclusively online, and it focuses on the market weeks. It's not serialized in the way that it was published bi-weekly, every 2 weeks, like like Ruth's did. Chapter 4 explores the aftermath of the sale and how the transition affected and continues to impact the industry. The sale marked the completion of the institutionalization of the fashion calendar, since the CFDA restructured it so that it currently operates as the official scheduler. This chapter explores what was lost and gained in the transition of the CFDA's takeover and reveals other fractures within the American industry. And if you could see here, the amount of shows and how many shows are happening is significantly increased since 10 years prior, or 17 years prior here during 1994 collections. Here we have 2010, February 2010 showing fall 2010. Chapter 5 discusses Finley's donation of the fashion calendar archive to special collections at FIT. The material object's inherent obsolescence was part of its design, but due to its granular nature in terms of the details and data it holds, the archive's value as a reflection of and contributor to the history of American fashion, popular culture, labor, economics, and business history is substantial. So after Ruth donated her archive to FIT, I worked alongside Special Collections and College Archives on digitizing and creating a digital humanities project. And so the 5th chapter focuses on the fashion calendar's second act, which is a digitization and historical digital humanities project, which allowed for us to not only digitize all of the pages of fashion calendar, but extract all of the data so that we can glean more and more information from this incredible resource and archive. We hit a few project challenges as we were doing it, which allowed us to expand the tools that we needed in order to achieve our goals. And here we have an artificial and an AI machine learning tool that was developed by a company based out of Quebec for us, that was able to read the fashion calendar's very distinctive formatting and parse all of this data into spreadsheets so that we can do more with the data. And I think this shows briefly the type of data visualizations and quantitative elements of how we transformed all of the data within the fashion calendar into this really dynamic online website. So it's available at fashioncalendar.fitnyc.edu. And the Fashion Calendar Research Database was funded by a Digitizing Hidden Collections grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources. Which is funded by the Mellon Foundation. And thanks to this grant, we were able to digitize every page. And so if you see here on the top left, there is a viewer that allows users to page by page flip through every issue like they were in special collections, and really feel what it was like to navigate the fashion calendar in that way. We extracted and parsed all of those locations, thousands and thousands and thousands of locations in the fashion calendar, and geocoded them, which allows for map visualizations not only of particular years, but you could cluster them by designer, by region, by types of garments shown, etc. And this was possible due to the data extraction, which allowed us to add identity information and category information to all of the names and entities who listed in the fashion calendar. And so we were able to add identity information such as we sought to transform the archive into a more complex digital humanities project that applied digital tools to quantify the information. Um, this approach was informed by concepts of critical cataloging and data analysis discussed by Emily Dobrinsky, um, and thinking about how vocabularies and identities can be added um, and help in guiding humanities research and reflect contemporary discourses about identity, social justice, and representation. We sought to contribute to a growing body of critical digital fashion studies resources. And what makes, with the data extracted, our team, which included trained students, um, normalized entities and individuals, and attributed identity information such as geographic location, gender, race, sexual orientation, among others, as well as in category information for different professions, different types of garments, different types of elements or spheres of the creative industries. And taking this approach, which is informed by feminist and global digital humanities research, seeks to highlight the impact of groups that are unseen or generally underrepresented within the historical record. And so, what makes the fashion calendar database so incredible is that it gives us an incredible record of not only all of the events that were happening in New York, domestically, and even abroad, but also is an incredible record of the people, communities who have really worked to make the fashion industry and creative industries in the United States uh, get to the level it is today. Here is a link to the Fashion Calendar Research Database. It is still a work in progress, and we are on to our next phase. You could access it here. It's completely open source and available to the public around the world. And please contact me if you are interested or have more questions about it. And here I also have a QR code for the Bloomsbury link to purchase in American Fashion. It really is a research title, and our my paperback version is going to come out at the end of the year, but it really was a 10-year labor of love getting all of this together and really investigating it very seriously within this book. And so I hope you enjoyed the presentation and I look forward to the questions.
Tremendous. Welcome back, everyone. That was incredible. As a fellow fashion writer myself, uh, and researcher, that is an incredible amount of work to go to not only to find it, but to correlate it, and then to have the ability to put it in a database. And so, just quantitatively, that's amazing. Um, you mentioned very in passing that you had talked to Ruth and that you also in your presentation described the sisters and the ladies and that dynamic. Could you, if possible, give us a sense of her as a person? Um, you humanize this for us just a little bit so we understand maybe how what her aspect was, how she related to you.
Thanks for that question, Gordon. Ruth truly was my mentor, and I felt so lucky and still feel extremely lucky to have known her and have been able to spend time with her. We started filming Calendar Girl in 2015, and we were able to spend a huge amount of time with Ruth, and I was able to spend many years with Ruth, even beyond um, the the making of the film, and was able to glean so much about her joie de vivre and her love of life. For anyone who knew Ruth, she was energetic and spunky and determined and such a wonderful, joyous person who was so passionate about her work and really performing service to her industry. She really understood the importance of what she did, the legacy of what she did, and how critical it was for the industry. Ruth was a single mother of three children. She was divorced very early on in her marriages, and so she was married, she got divorced, and then she was remarried, and then she was widowed, and she was the single mother of three children and was a business owner and had the business and fashion calendar based in her home office for this almost the 70 years that she ran it. And really for a great a picture of Ruth as a person, I really can't recommend enough for people to go and check out Calendar Girl, which is available on Vudu and Mubi and Amazon, because Ruth was such a amazing person and her spirit was such a light, I think, generally, not only on the industry, but the community around her and her family and her friends. And so what's amazing is that you see that in the trajectory of her work, like from her dedication to the publication, but then also her insistence on the entire archive being donated to FIT, making it available to the public and to the public and students. She really took care of not only everyone in her life and the fashion calendar, which she considered her first baby, but also for generations to come.
That's incredible. Every fashion group event I went to where she appeared, it was like visiting royalty. To spend an evening with her at Night of Stars, it was incredible. I think everyone in the room, famous, infamous, and everything in between knew her. Real quick, I need to ask you, do one thing that one of our participants has asked. Can you show us the slide again with the QR code for your book?
For the for
The
which
for your book.
for the book.
The
Okay.
book. Yes, thank you.
Right.
You have access to that.
Yes. And I know, yes, I think you have
Thank you
it.
so
There
much.
you go. I'll leave it up.
One other thing, because you also touch on the political in this, and I think in these politically charged times, that is something that is interest. Can you elaborate on the connections between the fashion calendar and soft power or political diplomacy? Particularly, I would think as it affected the economy and retail. I think that would definitely be in something you would have discovered in your research.
Definitely. So, as you may imagine, the wartime, although soft power and nation building and branding was happening since its inception, with the wartime listings are particularly interesting because they're really concentrated, especially as the United States was in a full war effort. And so, interestingly, I found listings pertaining to uh, in the early 1940s of more and more retail events happening in New York City at different department stores, which were collaborations between different countries, such as Peru and department stores. And so in 1941, the government of Peru held a huge retail event trying to um, expose American audiences to Peruvian merchandise. But interestingly, if you go back and look at the reasons for that, a lot of this has to do with the realignment of Latin American countries and the United States during World War II, and how FDR was trying to make sure that the Latin American countries were going to be on the side of the United States. And so on the back end, this created issues for Peruvian cotton shipments to Japan, which was now an enemy of the United States. And so there's this really not on the surface, exchange of global commodities that are happening, such as like short staple cotton from different countries to another, which because of the war created an entirely new system of friends and foes. And so because of that, a realignment of goods had to be encouraged. And I had found all these letters at the I don't think it was the State Department, but in the US like federal records of letters from the ambassador of Peru explaining um to his boss essentially that like we need to figure out and change the tariffs on Peruvian cotton coming to the United States because they can't ship to Japan anymore. But if we want them to support us, they need to figure out what they're going to do with their cotton. And so there's so many conversations that have to do with that you gain really a little bit of insight into with those listings from the fashion calendar. They provide really like a window into all of these other interconnections on the back end because we're dealing with like very large scale commodities, but also very small retail interactions.
No, that's tremendous. Great. Thank you. Because that is, even though it ostensibly was a service to do one thing, everything has its implications and its unforeseen consequences. So it's very interesting. I tell you what, stepping back a minute there, I do, if you would, we've had another question about the QR code for your fashion calendar book, which there we go. Uh, thank you for your help on that. What uh, thinking just largely about your database project and the project itself. Oh, what do you prefer, what do you see as its potential as a tool for academic study and particularly for industry research? It's great history. We love the history, but practically speaking, what can we take away from it today?
That's a great question. And I think, Gordon, what's really valuable from the database is that it really shows us all of the different um, tactics, trends, things that people tried throughout the century that consistently get reused to today. And it's interesting to think about different historical circumstances and how companies, individuals reacted to them, and how a lot of those same methods are repurposed for different periods. So, for example, I remember when I was starting to do research on the fashion calendar, it was 2012 and it was really, and 2013, and it was really like the beginning of the buy now, see now, buy now trend that a lot of designers were starting to think about participating in. But then as I did research, I found out that actually Martin Margiela had a Buy Now, See Now collection in the 90s, and that it was something that he experimented with very early on. And so it's, what's very interesting about fashion is that things are people have a short memory and then so it comes back very quickly. And I think the fashion calendar to show us larger patterns is very useful. Now, data wise, in terms of the quantitative element, tracing the participation of different designers over time, different types of regions over time, all of that is very useful. And we are also in the process of collaborating with the CFDA to hopefully gain the most recent 10 years of fashion calendar listings. And so the fashion calendar database will be made current to 2024, and people will be able to look at the most recent weeks as well. And so, research wise, I think it's really valuable in that way. And then the structure of it, looking at identity attribution and category attribution in databases is something that unbeknownst, sometimes I think doing something aren't taught the rules about that thing is very useful because we built a database that has a functionality and includes this identity information that a lot of data analysis and research is really now just looking at. And so, even as a model for future tools for research, it's a very interesting platform.
It is an incredible model for that. And you mentioned that you got a grant for this. What do you think those are very difficult, particularly in the humanities to get. If there was anyone, if, I'm sure many of the academicians that are in are looking for grants. What, what do you think put this over for the complete grant that you got? What was you think its sailing point to be such a success on the grant? If they were, in other words, I'm sorry, if they were writing a grant today, what could they learn from you for putting this together? There we go.
I think, well, first of all, let me just say it took many years to get it took multiple years and multiple tries to get the grant funding. And we were lucky that the Council of Library and Information Resources really does give you feedback on your grant application, which many grantors don't do. And so after our first couple of applications, they explained to us that like we actually really like your archive and we like what you want to do. We just need to make sure that you really have a very, very detailed understanding of all of the technical issues, all of the things that could go wrong. And I think that is the major thing that I learned is that we really detailed every step, every action, and laid everything out. And then even at that, even after we did that, we still came up with challenges, right? And so they really want to know that you sort of have all of your bases covered and then like your plan B is covered as well. But I think what made Fashion Calendar really important is that it truly is a unique archive. What Ruth did was so unique. There are no other publications like this. It is a completely unique collection that no other library holds. And it's an amount of data that is, although huge, very neatly tied to 70 years within the majority of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. And also, Ruth donated it with the hope that this would happen, right? So the
Nice.
support from the maker themselves, I think, is also key. So we were really lucky to have the support of Clear and the Mellon Foundation, and we're really grateful to them for the grant funds.
That's incredible. So uniqueness and attention, truly attention to detail seem to be that is very clearly what you're saying on that. I guess this gives way to a logical next and final question. What do you think of Fashion Week today and the fashion scheduling of today?
I think the fashion calendar today and the fashion scheduling today, um, what I argue in the book and what I talk about in the chapter about the post sale of Fashion Week is that ultimately I believe, or I argue that it really follows and is reflective of the maturation of the American fashion industry in that it adopted the positionality and the methods used by the French Fédération de la Mode, the Camera de la Moda, and other European fashion governing bodies. In that, there is a top-down approach where the institutional governing body is delineating the fashion calendar for those seasons while simultaneously supporting emerging designers through multitudes of programs and grant giving, etc. And so what was really important and we capture in the film, luckily enough, was that even Ruth herself understood that, the industry in New York had gotten so big and so organized and so globalized that it really needed to come out of her small office into a much sort of more structured scale. And so I think the fashion calendar today, the CFDA fashion calendar reflects that. Unfortunately, I think some designers in the past, when Ruth ran the calendar, she really opened it up to anyone. Like anyone could list and they could be on the same page as, an important fashion designer. It was just really delineated by timing and time slot. But at the same time, the reason why the CFDA really was the group to take over was because Fashion Week by 2010, 2011, 2014, the amount of brands and companies that would show in New York was immense and it became very disorganized just as a result of how popular it was showing in New York and how popular the New York market was. And so I think it's just a reflection of like time and where we're at more broadly and in a positive way, in my mind, it's sort of it confirms that that New York Fashion Week is um, truly arrived in the way that it in the past has been excluded from.
Well, tremendous. Thank you so much for your scholarship and for truly 10 years of research to put this together on top of writing the book, and thank you for joining us so much. And if do you have any questions of me? Anything we can end with? It's always a pleasure to see you at the club, and thank you so much, and thank you all for joining. And this has been a production of the National Arts Club. And for more information, you can see us again and learn more about us at our new site. Um, and I make sure I have to do this right myself, nacnyc.org. So thank you again, Natalie, and I look forward to seeing you again and everyone else. Thank you, sir. Good night.
Good night.